The secret desires controlling your mind. What Machiavelli knew before. Freud, have you ever done something and then wondered, why did I really do that? Maybe you bought something you didn't need, stayed in a relationship that wasn't working, or picked a fight over something small. We all like to think we know why we do what we do. We tell ourselves stories about our motives that sound logical and reasonable. But what if these stories are just cover-ups, simple explanations hiding much deeper forces that are actually controlling our behavior? Hey everyone, welcome to a brand new series where we explore how the most powerful people in history understood human psychology centuries before science confirmed their insights. Today we're diving into something that might completely change how you see yourself and others around you. Back in the 1500s, a sharp-eyed political advisor named Niccolò Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince. Everyone knows it as this ruthless guide to gaining power, but that's missing something crucial. Beneath the political advice, Machiavelli showed an incredible understanding of what really drives human behavior. Not the logical reasons we tell ourselves, but the hidden, unconscious desires we don't even realize are controlling us. Fast forward about 400 years, and a doctor in Vienna named Sigmund Freud basically revolutionizes our understanding of the human mind with his theory of the unconscious. Freud said our conscious thoughts are just the tip of the iceberg. Underneath the surface is this massive realm of unconscious desires, fears, and conflicts that are actually pulling the strings on our behavior. The wild thing is, Machiavelli seemed to understand all of this centuries before Freud was even born. He didn't have the scientific terms or the clinical evidence, but through pure observation of human behavior across history, he figured out the same fundamental truth. People are not driven primarily by reason, but by deep unconscious desires they themselves don't fully understand. What's even crazier is that while Freud was mainly interested in helping individuals understand themselves better, Machiavelli was focused on something else entirely: how to use this knowledge to influence and lead others. He was essentially creating a playbook for psychological influence hundreds of years before psychology even existed as a science. Let's start with the most basic insight both men shared. People are not primarily rational creatures. We like to think we make decisions based on careful thinking and clear reasons, but that's largely an illusion. Machiavelli wrote, "Men are so simple of mind, and so much dominated by their immediate needs, that a deceitful man will always find plenty who are ready to be deceived." In other words, our conscious rational mind is easily overwhelmed by our deeper unconscious desires. I remember working with a company where the CEO insisted all his decisions were based solely on the data and logical analysis. But watching him over time, it became obvious his choices consistently served deeper emotional needs. For control, for validation of his self-image as a visionary, for proving his worth to a successful father. Yet he remained completely blind to these motivations, always creating logical-sounding justifications after the fact. Freud would later call this rationalization. The way our conscious mind makes up reasonable-sounding explanations for behaviors that are actually driven by unconscious forces. Machiavelli observed the same mechanism at work in politics, noting how rulers would create noble-sounding justifications for actions that were really driven by raw desires for power, security, or revenge. This brings us to the first major unconscious drive that both Machiavelli and Freud recognized: the desire for power. Freud called this part of our unconscious mind the AD, the primal instinctual part of ourselves that wants immediate gratification of basic desires with no regard for consequences or social rules. Machiavelli didn't have this terminology, but he clearly understood the concept. He observed how rulers and those around them were driven by a raw hunger for power and control that they often disguised, even from themselves, with nobler motivations. As he wrote, Men never do good unless necessity drives them to it. He saw that beneath our civilized exterior lurks a primitive desire to dominate and control our environment. I've watched this play out in countless workplace dynamics. A manager claims they're micromanaging an employee for the good of the project, or to maintain quality standards, when the underlying unconscious motivation is actually a need to feel powerful and important. These managers aren't necessarily lying. They've just created a socially acceptable story that hides their deeper psychological needs, even from themselves. Freud would later formalize this understanding with his concept of sublimation, how primitive desires get redirected into socially acceptable channels. Machiavelli recognized the same psychological mechanism when he advised rulers to channel people's aggressive impulses toward external enemies rather than letting them focus on domestic problems. The second major unconscious drive both men identified was the desire for recognition and esteem. Freud explored how our sense of self-worth and identity is shaped by how others see us. Machiavelli, ever the practical observer, noted how even the most powerful rulers were driven by an intense need to be respected and admired. This is why Machiavelli put so much emphasis on the management of appearances. He famously wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." He understood that people's perception of you triggers powerful unconscious responses that logic can rarely overcome. A ruler who appears strong, decisive, and virtuous will command automatic respect, regardless of the reality behind that appearance. I've seen this principle at work in modern leadership contexts. One particularly effective executive I worked with was meticulous about creating an impression of calm confidence in crisis situations. He told me privately that he often felt uncertain and anxious when facing major challenges, but he knew that projecting confidence had a powerful psychological effect on his team. Their unconscious minds responded to the image of strength he projected, which in turn actually created real strength in the organization. This connects to one of Freud's most important insights: the power of transference, how we unconsciously project feelings from our past relationships onto people in our present. Freud noticed how patients would unconsciously relate to him as if he were a parent or authority figure from their past. Centuries earlier, Machiavelli had observed the same psychological mechanism in politics. He noted how people unconsciously relate to rulers as father figures, projecting all the emotional complexities of that relationship onto their political leaders. The wise prince, he suggested, should understand and use this unconscious dynamic to inspire both love and fear. The same powerful emotions children feel toward parental figures. I once consulted for an organization where a new leader took over from a beloved, long-term founder. The team's response had nothing to do with the new leader's actual qualities or decisions. They were unconsciously comparing her to their idealized memory of the founder, who had taken on an almost parental role in the organization. Understanding this dynamic was crucial for the new leader to navigate the unconscious emotional landscape she had inherited. Both Machiavelli and Freud also recognized a third powerful unconscious drive: the need for security and the fear of death. Freud eventually developed this into his theory of the death instinct and the life instinct, the competing unconscious forces that drive much of human behavior. Machiavelli, more practically, observed how fear of harm is one of the most powerful motivators in human affairs. Machiavelli wrote, "Men worry less about doing an injury to one who makes himself loved than to one who makes himself feared." He understood that beneath our civilized exterior is a primal fear of death and harm that can override all rational consideration when triggered. The wise leader knows how to access this deep unconscious drive when necessary, while also being careful not to abuse it. In modern contexts, I've seen how security concerns can completely transform rational decision-making. companies will spend millions on security measures against highly unlikely threats because the unconscious fear response is so powerful when triggered. Politicians know that raising security concerns activates deep unconscious fears that can override voters' rational assessment of much more statistically significant risks. One of the most fascinating connections between Machiavelli and Freud is their understanding of inner psychological conflict. Freud developed an entire model of the mind divided into conflicting parts: the ID, primitive desires; the superego, internalized social rules; and the ego, the part that mediates between the two. He showed how much of our psychological suffering comes from the conflicts between these different aspects of our unconscious. Machiavelli didn't have this theoretical framework, but he clearly observed the same psychological reality. He wrote extensively about how people are torn between competing desires, between their appetite for gain and their fear of punishment, between their craving for freedom and their need for security, between their selfish impulses and their social values. A brilliant insight from Machiavelli was how to exploit these inner conflicts in others. He advised rulers to position themselves as the solution to people's inner psychological tensions. If people fear both anarchy and tyranny, present yourself as the middle path that protects from both. If people both desire change and fear disruption, position yourself as offering controlled, safe transformation. I've seen modern leaders use this same insight masterfully. One CEO I worked with was taking over a company that desperately needed transformation but was paralyzed by fear of change. Rather than fighting either impulse, he acknowledged both the desire for improvement and the fear of disruption as legitimate. Then he positioned his leadership as the solution to this inner conflict, a path to change that also preserved what people valued most about the organization. He wasn't manipulating. He was addressing a real psychological need created by the conflict between different unconscious drives. Both Machiavelli and Freud also had profound insights into defense mechanisms, the ways we protect ourselves from uncomfortable psychological realities. Freud cataloged these mechanisms in detail: denial, projection, displacement, and so on. Machiavelli observed many of the same patterns without naming them formally. For example, Machiavelli noted how people will often attribute their failures to external circumstances while taking personal credit for their successes. Freud would later call this projection, putting uncomfortable parts of ourselves onto others. Machiavelli advised rulers to work with this psychological tendency by taking credit for successes while ensuring others took blame for failures. I've seen this play out dramatically in corporate settings. When projects succeed, everyone wants to claim credit. When they fail, the blame shifting begins immediately. Smart leaders don't fight this psychological tendency. They work with it by creating structures that channel it productively, like ensuring clear accountability from the beginning and building in reflection processes that make defensive reactions less necessary. Another defense mechanism both men recognized was denial, our mind's capacity to simply reject realities that are too threatening to our self-image or emotional stability. Freud saw this in his patients who would simply refuse to acknowledge painful truths about themselves or their pasts. Machiavelli observed the same mechanism in political contexts, noting how people would ignore obvious evidence of corruption or incompetence in leaders they were emotionally invested in. This brings us to a crucial insight for practical application. If you want to influence people, you need to work with their defense mechanisms, not against them. Directly challenging someone's self-protective psychological barriers usually just strengthens them. Both Machiavelli and Freud understood that effective influence requires finding paths around these defenses rather than attacking them head-on. I remember working with a brilliant executive who was also extraordinarily defensive about any perceived criticism. Direct feedback would trigger immediate justification and counterattack. A wise mentor advised me to completely change approach, to frame everything in terms of building on his existing strengths rather than fixing weaknesses. This path around his psychological defenses opened the way for substantial growth and change that direct confrontation never could have achieved. This connects to perhaps the most practical insight from both Machiavelli and Freud: the power of indirect influence. Freud developed free association and dream analysis as indirect ways to access the unconscious, recognizing that direct questioning often hits psychological walls. Machiavelli, similarly, advised rulers on indirect methods of shaping perceptions and behavior, understanding that direct commands often provoke resistance. In negotiation, this insight is incredibly valuable. I've seen negotiators make the critical mistake of directly challenging someone's position, which immediately activates all their psychological defenses. Master negotiators instead use questions, reflective listening, and tentative suggestions that allow the other person to maintain their psychological equilibrium while still moving toward a solution. The same principle applies in leadership. Direct orders often trigger unconscious resistance. Skilled leaders instead create contexts where people can arrive at the desired conclusion themselves, preserving their sense of autonomy and avoiding the activation of psychological defenses. So what can we learn from this exploration of how Machiavelli anticipated Freud's insights into the unconscious mind? First, that understanding the gap between what people consciously think, motivates them, and what actually drives their behavior is essential for effective influence. Second, that working with unconscious psychological patterns rather than against them is far more effective than trying to overcome them through direct confrontation or pure logical argument. Perhaps most importantly, this understanding gives us greater compassion for ourselves and others. When we recognize that much of human behavior is driven by unconscious forces rather than deliberate malice or stupidity, it's easier to respond constructively rather than reactively to challenges and conflicts. For your own development, start noticing the gap between the reasons people give for their actions, including yourself, and the patterns of behavior that suggest deeper motivations. Practice observing unconscious desires for power, recognition, and security in everyday interactions. And most importantly, learn to work with these psychological realities rather than pretending they don't exist or fighting against them directly. Next time, we'll explore how Machiavelli anticipated another major psychological framework: behavioral conditioning. Centuries before B.F. Skinner formally developed the science of operant conditioning. We'll look at how understanding reward and punishment systems can transform your ability to influence any situation. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you noticed unconscious motivations driving behavior in your workplace or relationships? What psychological insights have you found most useful in leadership or negotiation situations? Let me know below. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The goal is to help you better understand human psychology and improve your leadership and negotiation skills, not to manipulate others unethically. The hidden reward system. Controlling your behavior. Machiavelli and Skinner's dark secrets. What if I told you that your choices aren't really yours? That your decisions, habits, and even your deepest loyalties are being shaped by invisible forces you're not even aware of? This isn't science fiction, it's the science of behavior, and the most powerful people in history have been using these principles for centuries. Hey everyone, welcome back. In our last video, we explored how Machiavelli understood the unconscious mind centuries before Freud. Today, we're diving into something even more practical: how the powerful use rewards and punishments to shape behavior without people even realizing it's happening. 500 years ago, Machiavelli wrote The Prince, revealing the hidden mechanics of how rulers control their subjects. Then in the 1900s, a psychologist named B.F. Skinner put these same principles into scientific terms with his theory of operant conditioning. What Machiavelli figured out through raw observation, Skinner later proved in the laboratory. So grab a drink, get comfortable, and prepare to see your own behavior in a completely different light. Fair warning though, once you understand these principles, you'll start noticing them everywhere. In your workplace, in your relationships, even in how you raise your kids or train your pets. Let's start with the most basic insight that both Machiavelli and Skinner shared. Behavior is controlled more effectively by its consequences than by intentions, values, or beliefs. In simple terms, people do what gets rewarded and avoid what gets punished. This seems obvious, but most of us dramatically underestimate how much our behavior is shaped by these simple mechanics. Machiavelli understood this perfectly. He wrote, "Men are quick to change their mind about their rulers when they see themselves rewarded by unexpected benefits and punished by unexpected severities." He knew that concrete consequences shape behavior far more powerfully than abstract principles or promises. Centuries later, Skinner would prove this scientifically in his famous experiments. He showed that animals and people could be taught to perform incredibly complex behaviors through carefully managed rewards and punishments. He called this operant conditioning, the process by which behavior is shaped by its consequences. I saw a perfect example of this in a company that was struggling with innovation. The leaders kept giving speeches about the importance of taking risks and thinking outside the box. But when employees actually tried new approaches, they were criticized when those attempts weren't immediately successful. Despite all the talk about innovation, they were unconsciously punishing the very behavior they wanted to encourage. Not surprisingly, innovation remained low despite all their speeches and mission statements. This brings us to the first major principle that both Machiavelli and Skinner understood. Rewards work better than punishments for creating lasting behavior change. Machiavelli advised rulers to be strategic with both, but noted that men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, but not of more serious ones. In other words, small punishments often create resentment without changing behavior, while rewards build loyalty and positive motivation. Skinner would later demonstrate this scientifically, showing that while punishment can suppress behavior temporarily, positive reinforcement creates more sustainable behavior change. Animals and people who are rewarded for desired behaviors will continue those behaviors enthusiastically, while those who are mainly punished often develop avoidance, resentment, and creative ways to escape the system. I've seen this play out dramatically in different management styles. I worked with two division heads in the same company with completely different approaches. The first relied heavily on criticism, tight deadlines, and threats. His team worked from fear and did the minimum to avoid trouble. The second used recognition, incentives, and positive feedback. Her team consistently outperformed, showed more initiative, and actually enjoyed their work. Same company, same compensation structure, dramatically different results based solely on whether behavior was shaped primarily through reward or punishment. This doesn't mean punishment has no place. Both Machiavelli and Skinner recognized its necessity in certain situations. Machiavelli famously suggested that it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, acknowledging that fear, anticipation of punishment, is sometimes more reliable than affection. Skinner similarly found that certain behaviors could be eliminated quickly through punishment, though the effects weren't always lasting. The key insight they shared was that punishment needs to be used carefully and strategically. Machiavelli advised that any necessary punishment should be done all at once, rather than drawn out over time. This aligns perfectly with what Skinner would later discover. that immediate consistent consequences are far more effective in shaping behavior than delayed or inconsistent ones. This brings us to another powerful principle both men understood: timing matters enormously. Machiavelli advised rulers to ensure that any punishments were clearly connected to the offense, while benefits should be given gradually so people constantly have something to strive for. He recognized that the timing of consequences dramatically affects their impact on behavior. Skinner would later formalize this understanding with his research on schedules of reinforcement, the patterns by which rewards are delivered. He discovered something fascinating. Rewards given on an unpredictable variable schedule created the strongest, most persistent behaviors. Think about how slot machines work. You never know exactly when you'll win, which makes the behavior, putting money in, incredibly resistant to extinction. I watched a brilliant leader use this principle to transform team engagement. Rather than the standard predictable employee recognition program, she implemented random spot bonuses and recognition moments. Team members never knew when their efforts might be recognized, which kept everyone consistently performing at their best. Engagement scores rose dramatically compared to other departments with more predictable reward systems. This variable reward principle explains why social media is so addictive. You never know when you'll get likes or comments, why gambling is so hard to quit, and why certain leadership styles create such fierce loyalty. Unpredictable positive feedback creates stronger behavioral patterns than predictable rewards. Machiavelli intuitively understood this when he advised rulers to vary their approach, sometimes being generous, sometimes being stern, rather than being completely predictable. He knew that people become complacent with consistent patterns but remain engaged when there's an element of unpredictability. Another crucial insight both men shared was about the power of small incremental changes. Machiavelli advised that significant changes should be introduced gradually to avoid resistance. Skinner discovered the same principle through his experiments on shaping, the process of rewarding successive approximations of a desired behavior until the complete behavior is established. I saw this work beautifully in a manufacturing company implementing a major new safety protocol. Rather than expecting perfect compliance immediately, which created resistance, they broke the protocol into small steps and recognized progress at each stage. By rewarding incremental improvements, they eventually achieved full compliance with minimal pushback. They were essentially using Skinner's shaping technique without realizing it. Both Machiavelli and Skinner also understood the power of intermittent reinforcement, the principle that behaviors rewarded occasionally rather than every time become the most deeply ingrained. Machiavelli advised rulers to perform acts of remarkable generosity, occasionally rather than consistently, making each instance more impactful. Skinner would later prove through his experiments that intermittent reinforcement creates the most persistent behavioral patterns. This explains why gambling is so addictive. You win just often enough to keep you playing. It explains why abusive relationships are so hard to leave. The occasional moments of kindness have a powerful reinforcing effect because of their intermittent nature, and it explains why certain leaders inspire such deep loyalty. Their occasional recognition means more than constant praise would. I watched a manager use this principle unintentionally but effectively. He was generally quite demanding and critical, but occasionally gave specific, genuine praise. Those rare positive moments had an incredible impact on his team. They worked tirelessly to earn his infrequent approval. Was this healthy? Probably not, but it was a powerful demonstration of how intermittent reinforcement shapes behavior. Another key principle both Machiavelli and Skinner recognized was the importance of immediate consequences. Machiavelli noted that any punishment should be swift and clearly connected to the offense. Skinner would later demonstrate experimentally that the effectiveness of both rewards and punishments diminishes dramatically with delay. This insight has huge implications for management and leadership. Annual performance reviews are largely ineffective at shaping day-to-day behavior because the feedback comes too long after the actual behaviors. Leaders who provide immediate feedback, both positive and constructive, have a much stronger impact on their team's performance. I worked with one organization that completely transformed their performance by simply implementing a weekly feedback system rather than waiting for quarterly reviews. The immediacy of the feedback loop dramatically improved how quickly people adjusted their behavior and improved their results. Both Machiavelli and Skinner also understood the power of public consequences versus private ones. Machiavelli advised that punishments should sometimes be public to deter others, while Skinner observed that social reinforcement, praise or criticism from the group, often has greater impact than direct consequences. This explains why public recognition programs can be so effective in organizations. When someone is praised publicly for specific behaviors, it not only reinforces those behaviors for that person, but also signals to everyone else what is valued. The same principle works in families, friend groups, and communities. Public acknowledgement shapes group norms far more effectively than private feedback. I witnessed this principle dramatically change safety behavior in a construction company. Rather than just punishing violations privately, they began publicly recognizing safety champions each week. Within months, safety incidents dropped by over 60%, as the social reinforcement changed the entire culture more effectively than the previous punishment-focused approach. One of the most powerful insights both men had was about the importance of clear, observable behaviors rather than attitudes or intentions. Machiavelli focused on how rulers should judge people by their actions, not their words or claimed motivations. Skinner built his entire scientific approach around observable behavior rather than internal states. This practical focus offers a powerful lesson for modern leadership. Many organizations waste time trying to change employee attitudes or feelings rather than focusing on specific behaviors. The most effective leaders identify precisely what behaviors they want to see, then create systems that reward those specific actions. Attitudes and feelings often follow behavior change, not the other way around. I consulted for a retail chain struggling with customer service. They had tried motivational speakers, values statements, and emotional appeals about caring for customers, all with minimal impact. When they shifted to identifying specific service behaviors, measuring them precisely, and creating immediate rewards for those exact behaviors, their service scores improved dramatically. Focus on behavior first, and attitude often follows. Both Machiavelli and Skinner also recognized that different individuals respond to different rewards and punishments. Machiavelli advised rulers to understand the specific desires and fears of different personality types among their subjects. Skinner observed that the effectiveness of any reinforcer depends on the individual's specific history and preferences. This principle is crucial for effective leadership. The recognition that motivates one team member might embarrass another. The incentive that inspires one person might actually demotivate someone else. Great leaders take time to understand what specifically motivates each individual rather than using one-size-fits-all approaches. I worked with a sales manager who transformed his team's performance by customizing incentives based on individual preferences. Some reps received financial bonuses, others got additional time off, and others earned prestigious development opportunities, all for hitting the same targets. By personalizing the rewards to match individual motivations, he got far better results than the standard commission structure had produced. Now let's address the ethical elephant in the room. Both Machiavelli and Skinner faced criticism for their seemingly mechanistic view of human behavior. Critics argued that Machiavelli reduced politics to manipulation, while Skinner reduced human experience to stimulus and response. Both were accused of removing dignity and free will from the human equation. These criticisms raise important ethical questions about applying these principles. Is it manipulative to systematically use rewards and punishments to shape others' behavior? Where is the line between influence and control? Between effective leadership and exploitation? I believe the answer lies in intention and transparency. Using behavioral principles to help people achieve their own goals or to create positive outcomes for everyone involved is fundamentally different from using these same principles to exploit or harm others. The techniques themselves are neutral. The ethics lie in how and why they're applied. Transparency also matters greatly. When people understand the system they're operating in, when the rewards and consequences are clear and openly acknowledged, they maintain their autonomy and dignity. It's the hidden deceptive application of these principles that raises the most serious ethical concerns. For example, I worked with a healthcare organization that openly implemented a recognition program for patient care behaviors. Everyone understood exactly what was being measured and rewarded, and why these behaviors mattered for patient outcomes. This transparent application of behavioral principles improved both employee satisfaction and patient care simultaneously. In contrast, I've seen toxic leaders use the same principles in manipulative ways, creating unpredictable environments where team members never know what will trigger praise or criticism, using intermittent reinforcement to create unhealthy dependence, or using public humiliation as a control mechanism. Same principles, dramatically different ethical implications based on intention and transparency. So what can we learn from this exploration of how Machiavelli anticipated Skinner's insights into behavioral conditioning? First, that understanding the mechanics of how rewards and punishments shape behavior gives you tremendous insight into both yourself and others. Second, that applying these principles ethically requires careful attention to intention, transparency, and outcomes for all involved. For your own development, start noticing the reward and punishment systems operating around you. What behaviors get reinforced in your workplace, even unintentionally? What consequences are shaping your habits, for better or worse? Once you see these behavioral mechanisms operating, you can make more conscious choices about which systems you want to participate in and how you might design more effective and ethical systems yourself. If you're in a leadership position, consider how you might apply these insights ethically. Are you clearly identifying the specific behaviors that create success? Are you providing immediate, meaningful feedback? Are you primarily building through reward rather than suppressing through punishment? Are you transparent about what you're measuring and why? Next time, we'll explore how Machiavelli anticipated another major psychological framework, the dark side of human personality, and how to recognize manipulative individuals before they cause harm. We'll look at how his insights align with modern research on personality disorders and manipulation tactics. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you noticed these behavioral principles at work in your own life? What reward systems have shaped your behavior, either positively or negatively? Let me know below. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The goal is to help you better understand behavioral psychology and improve your leadership skills, not to manipulate others unethically. The most dangerous people you'll ever meet. Machiavelli's warning about psychopaths. Have you ever met someone who seemed perfectly charming and trustworthy, but something about them just felt off? Maybe they made big promises they never kept, or could turn their charm on and off like a switch. Or perhaps you've worked with someone who took credit for everyone else's work, blamed others for their mistakes, and somehow always failed upward despite leaving destruction in their wake. If this sounds familiar, you might have encountered what modern psychology calls a psychopath. Someone with a specific set of personality traits that make them experts at manipulation and completely unconcerned with how their actions hurt others. These aren't just difficult people, they're actually wired differently, and they can cause enormous damage in workplaces, relationships, and entire societies. Hey everyone, welcome back. In our previous videos, we explored how Machiavelli understood the unconscious mind centuries before Freud, and how he anticipated Skinner's insights on behavioral conditioning. Today, we're diving into something even more fascinating: how Machiavelli described psychopathic behavior patterns 5 centuries before modern psychology identified and categorized them. 500 years ago, Machiavelli wasn't just writing about how rulers should behave. He was also warning about dangerous personality types that could destroy organizations and societies. Then in the late 20th century, psychologist Robert Hare developed what's now considered the gold standard for identifying psychopathic traits: the psychopathy checklist. What's mind-blowing is how perfectly Machiavelli's descriptions of dangerous personalities align with what modern science now confirms. Before we go further, I want to clarify something important. When I talk about psychopaths, I'm not using the term the way Hollywood does, as a synonym for violent criminals or serial killers. In psychology, psychopathy refers to a specific constellation of personality traits that exists on a spectrum. Most psychopaths never commit violent crimes, but they do cause significant harm through manipulation, deception, and emotional exploitation. And they're far more common than most people realize. So let's dive into what Machiavelli understood about these dangerous personalities, how modern science has confirmed his observations, and, most importantly, how you can protect yourself when you encounter them. Let's start with the core insight both Machiavelli and Hare share. Some people can mimic normal human emotions without actually experiencing them. Machiavelli wrote about advisors and political figures who could appear merciful, faithful, humane, sincere, religious, while being none of those things internally. He wasn't describing simple hypocrisy. He was identifying people who could convincingly wear these emotions like masks while feeling nothing underneath. Centuries later, Hare would identify this same trait as the defining feature of psychopathy: a profound emotional shallowness combined with the ability to simulate normal emotional responses. As he puts it, psychopaths know the words, but not the music of emotions. They can intellectually understand and mimic feelings like empathy, remorse, and love without actually experiencing them. I once worked with an executive who was a textbook example of this. In meetings, he could display perfect empathy, leaning forward, making appropriate facial expressions, saying all the right things. But the moment the person in distress left the room, he would immediately switch to another topic without any transition, as if the emotional moment never happened. There was no lingering effect because the empathy wasn't real. It was a performance that served a purpose. Machiavelli was particularly concerned with how these individuals used charm and flattery to advance themselves. He warned about advisors who present things which appear all profit and no loss, and who are ready with their services in times of prosperity, but in adversity they turn away. He was describing what Hare would later identify as superficial charm and manipulative behavior, the ability to be extremely likable when it serves their purpose, only to disappear or turn on you when you're no longer useful. I witnessed this dynamic in a marketing team where a new hire quickly became everyone's favorite colleague. He remembered birthdays, brought coffee, offered to help with projects, and charmed senior leadership. But when the department faced layoffs, he immediately provided leadership with a detailed list of everyone else's performance issues, many fabricated or exaggerated, to ensure he survived the cuts. The persona of helpful team player was instantly replaced by ruthless self-preservation the moment circumstances changed. Both Machiavelli and Hare noted another key trait: grandiose self-worth. Machiavelli described dangerous advisors who believe themselves more wise and able than in fact they are, people with an inflated sense of their own abilities and importance. Hare would later document this same pattern. Psychopaths typically have a dramatically inflated view of their own talents and contributions, even when objective evidence shows otherwise. This grandiosity makes them particularly dangerous in organizational settings. I consulted for a company where a mid-level manager claimed credit for an entire department's successes while blaming all failures on his team. Despite mediocre results, he convinced senior leadership he was irreplaceable. When finally terminated, after causing several top performers to quit, financial auditing revealed he had been manipulating performance metrics for years while extracting increasing compensation and perks. Another trait both Machiavelli and Hare identified is pathological lying. Machiavelli wrote that certain personality types are ready to swear to anything, but when the need arises, they break their oath with equal readiness. He wasn't describing occasional dishonesty. He was describing people who lie constantly, seamlessly, and without any of the normal physiological signs of discomfort that most people show when being dishonest. Hare would later document this same pattern, noting that psychopaths lie with such ease and confidence that they often pass lie detector tests. They don't experience the anxiety or cognitive discomfort normal people feel when lying, which makes their deception particularly convincing. I saw this trait in action when a consulting firm hired what seemed like a superstar with impressive credentials. He told detailed, captivating stories about his previous work with major clients and his personal connections with industry leaders. Everyone was impressed, until a routine background check revealed almost none of it was true. When confronted, rather than showing shame or anxiety, he simply shifted to new, equally convincing stories to explain the misunderstanding. The lies were constant, detailed, and delivered without any sign of discomfort. Perhaps the most chilling trait both Machiavelli and Hare identified is a complete lack of remorse or guilt. Machiavelli described individuals who could commit terrible acts and yet be able to color them in such a way as to give the appearance of virtue. He was identifying people who feel no guilt about harming others and are concerned only with managing how their actions are perceived. Hare would later identify this absence of remorse as one of the most reliable indicators of psychopathy. What makes this trait particularly dangerous is that without the internal break of guilt, there's no natural limit to what these individuals might do to achieve their goals. I once worked with a manager who systematically took credit for subordinates' work while blaming them for his mistakes. When one employee confronted him privately, he engineered that person's termination through a campaign of subtle undermining and false accusations. When asked later if he had any regrets about destroying someone's career, he replied with genuine confusion, "Why would I? He was in my way." There was no guilt, no second-guessing, just a cold calculation of self-interest. Both Machiavelli and Hare also observed a common behavioral pattern in these personalities: a parasitic lifestyle. Machiavelli wrote about advisors who seek to build their own fortune on the ruins of their prince, describing people who systematically exploit others for personal gain without contributing value themselves. Hare would later identify this same pattern, noting that psychopaths typically live off others' efforts while contributing little themselves. They see relationships primarily as opportunities for exploitation rather than mutual exchange or contribution. I consulted for a startup where one co-founder displayed this pattern perfectly. While others worked 80-hour weeks developing the product, he spent his time networking at conferences and cultivating media relationships. He contributed virtually nothing to the actual business, but positioned himself as the face of the company. When acquisition offers came, he maneuvered to maximize his payout while minimizing others' shares, despite their much greater contribution to the company's success. Both Machiavelli and Hare also noted these personalities' poor behavioral controls, their tendency toward impulsivity and low frustration tolerance. Machiavelli described advisors who rush wildly into affairs driven by hunger for money or ambition, describing people whose impulses override prudence and long-term thinking. Hare would later identify impulsivity as a core psychopathic trait. Despite often being skilled manipulators, psychopaths typically have poor self-regulation in other areas, resulting in erratic behavior when their desires are frustrated. I witnessed this trait when a seemingly polished executive completely lost control during a minor disagreement in a meeting. For a moment, the carefully maintained mask of charm dropped, revealing a frightening rage that left everyone stunned. The incident was never mentioned again, and he resumed his charismatic persona immediately afterward. But it was a glimpse behind the facade that no one forgot. Another trait both identified is what Hare calls shallow affect, a limited range of genuine emotions. Machiavelli wrote about people who have neither the natural nor artificial emotions that can be observed in all men. He wasn't calling them unemotional. He was describing something more specific, a certain emotional flatness or shallowness underneath the simulated responses. I observed this quality in an otherwise charming manager who displayed perfectly appropriate emotional responses in professional situations, but showed striking emotional poverty in unguarded moments. During casual conversations, he would analyze others' emotions with detached curiosity rather than empathetic understanding. He could describe what emotions should be felt in various situations, but seemed to experience only a narrow band himself, primarily irritation, satisfaction, or boredom. Both Machiavelli and Hare also identified what modern psychology calls a failure to accept responsibility. Machiavelli noted how certain advisors are ready to attribute everything good to their own prudence and everything bad to the malignity of fortune. He was describing people who systematically take credit for successes while blaming external factors for failures. This pattern is particularly dangerous in organizational settings because it prevents learning and accountability. I worked with a director who had an impressive record of successes on paper, but closer examination revealed a pattern. He joined projects that were already succeeding, claimed credit, and then moved to new opportunities before inevitable problems emerged. When problems did occur on his watch, he had an extraordinary ability to shift blame to others while maintaining his reputation. Perhaps most importantly, both Machiavelli and Hare recognized these individuals' extraordinary ability to identify and exploit others' weaknesses. Machiavelli wrote that certain personalities have great self-possession and cunning, making themselves appear open, trustworthy, and full of goodwill. Yet beneath this show of virtue, they hide unscrupulous duplicity. He was describing people with an almost predatory ability to identify what others need or want, then appear to offer exactly that while actually pursuing their own agenda. I saw this trait in action when a new hire quickly determined each colleague's insecurities and desires, then tailored his approach accordingly. With the insecure manager, he was deferential and admiring. With ambitious peers, he offered connections and opportunities. With nurturing types, he shared personal struggles. Each person thought they had a uniquely genuine connection with him, not realizing he was presenting completely different personas to different people based on what would gain their trust. So how can you protect yourself from these dangerous personalities? Both Machiavelli and modern psychology offer some guidance. First, look for patterns rather than isolated incidents. Machiavelli advised judging people by the results of their actions over time rather than their words or occasional gestures. Psychopaths are often skilled at making positive first impressions and performing generous acts when strategically valuable. But over time, a pattern of self-serving behavior usually emerges. I watched a consulting firm waste months on a candidate who interviewed brilliantly and had impressive references. Had they investigated more thoroughly, they would have discovered his pattern: joining companies, creating stellar first impressions, extracting maximum resources and advancement, then leaving abruptly when accountability loomed. A pattern he repeated at multiple organizations. Second, pay attention to how they treat people who can't help them. Machiavelli noted that dangerous personalities treat people differently based solely on their usefulness. One of the most reliable indicators of character is how someone treats people from whom they have nothing to gain. I observed an executive who was unfailingly charming with superiors and strategic peers, but dismissive and even cruel to support staff and junior employees. This stark contrast in behavior based solely on others' utility to him was a clear warning sign that many missed by only seeing how he treated them personally. Third, trust demonstrated behavior over words. Machiavelli warned about people whose promises exceed their actions. With psychopathic personalities, there's typically a significant gap between what they say and what they actually deliver. I worked with a manager who made grandiose promises to his team about resources, recognition, and advancement. Team members who believed these promises were inevitably disappointed, while those who judged him based on past behavior, a history of broken commitments, protected themselves from exploitation. Fourth, be wary of the too good to be true situation. Machiavelli warned about advisors who present options with all profit and no loss. Psychopaths are skilled at creating offers that seem impossibly perfect, concealing the actual costs until you're already committed. I consulted for a company that partnered with what seemed like an ideal client offering extraordinary terms. Only later did they discover the hidden costs and constraints that made the deal extremely unfavorable. The executive who negotiated it had deliberately concealed these aspects while emphasizing the benefits, creating an illusion of perfect opportunity. Fifth, maintain strong boundaries. Machiavelli advised keeping potentially dangerous individuals at a distance where you can observe their actions, but they cannot affect your own. With psychopathic personalities, clear boundaries are essential because they typically test and gradually erode limits. I witnessed a junior employee's boundaries being systematically dismantled by a manipulative supervisor who started with small requests outside normal expectations, gradually increased demands, and used emotional manipulation to override objections. By the time the employee recognized the exploitation, the normal boundaries of the professional relationship had been so eroded that extraction was extremely difficult. Let's address an important question. What's the difference between Machiavellian strategy and psychopathic manipulation? After all, Machiavelli himself advised rulers on tactics that might seem manipulative. The critical difference lies in purpose and empathic capacity. Ethical Machiavellian strategy acknowledges the realities of human psychology and power dynamics, but uses this understanding for legitimate goals while maintaining basic empathy for others. Psychopathic manipulation uses similar tactics, but without empathic constraint and purely for self-interest, regardless of harm caused. For example, a leader using Machiavellian insights might strategically balance rewards and punishments to maintain organizational discipline. They understand human psychology, but still fundamentally care about their people's well-being and the organization's legitimate mission. A psychopathic personality uses similar tactics, but with crucial differences. They feel no genuine concern for others' well-being, have no commitment to organizational purpose beyond personal gain, and will cause unlimited harm to others if it serves their interests. I've seen this distinction in action. One CEO made tough decisions during a financial crisis, including layoffs that caused real pain. However, he was transparent about the situation, took the largest personal pay cut, provided maximum possible support to affected employees, and was genuinely distressed by the impact on people's lives. He was using Machiavellian realism, but with intact empathy and legitimate purpose. In contrast, another executive engineered a crisis to justify eliminating rivals, replaced them with loyal supporters, extracted increased compensation for managing the difficult situation, and showed no concern for the careers he destroyed in the process. The tactics were superficially similar, but the absence of empathy and purely self-serving motivation revealed the psychopathic pattern. So what can we learn from this exploration of how Machiavelli anticipated modern understanding of psychopathic personalities? First, that these dangerous character types have existed throughout history and operate in predictable patterns. Second, that recognizing these patterns early can save you from enormous personal and professional damage. Most importantly, this knowledge gives us power. When you understand how manipulative personalities operate, their tactics become more visible and less effective. What makes psychopaths dangerous isn't just their lack of empathy, it's also our failure to recognize them until significant damage has been done. For your own development, start paying attention to patterns of behavior in your professional and personal relationships. Look beyond charisma and first impressions to consistent actions over time. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong about someone who seems perfect on paper, and maintain clear boundaries with anyone who shows signs of these problematic traits. Next time, we'll explore how Machiavelli's insights intersect with Martha Stout's research on sociopathy in everyday life, examining how the principles we've discussed operate in normal social settings and what that means for ethical leadership. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you encountered people with these traits in your workplace or personal life? What warning signs did you notice, and how did you protect yourself? Let me know below. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The goal is to help you recognize manipulative patterns and protect yourself from exploitation, not to encourage unethical behavior or amateur diagnosis of mental health conditions. The 4% who rule the world. Machiavelli and the Science of No Conscience. What if I told you that right now in your workplace, your neighborhood, maybe even in your family, there are people who look and act just like everyone else? Except for one crucial difference. They have no conscience, no inner voice telling them right from wrong, no guilt when they hurt others, no shame when they break social rules. And what if these people, who make up about 4% of the population, have a natural advantage in gaining power over the rest of us? Hey everyone, welcome back. In our previous videos, we've explored how Machiavelli's observations align with modern psychological research on the unconscious mind, behavioral conditioning, and psychopathic traits. Today, we're taking things even deeper by looking at something fundamental to human society: conscience, and how its absence shapes power dynamics around us. 5 centuries ago, Machiavelli shocked the world by describing how rulers could succeed by setting aside conventional morality when necessary. Many readers throughout history misunderstood him as simply promoting ruthlessness, but what he was actually doing was something much more nuanced. He was recognizing that some people naturally operate without the constraints of conscience and how this affects power structures. Fast forward to the 21st century, and clinical psychologist Martha Stout published her groundbreaking book, The Sociopath Next Door, revealing that about 4% of the general population are sociopaths, people who completely lack conscience while appearing perfectly normal. What's fascinating is how perfectly her modern research aligns with what Machiavelli observed through raw experience centuries earlier. So grab a drink, Get comfortable and prepare for a journey that might change how you see the social world around you. Fair warning though, once you understand how conscience shapes society and how its absence creates hidden power dynamics, you'll start noticing patterns in your everyday life that you can't unsee. Let's start with the most fundamental insight both Machiavelli and Stout share. Conscience is not universal. Most of us assume that everyone has some version of what we experience as conscience. That inner voice that makes us feel bad when we harm others or break important social rules. Both Machiavelli and Stout recognized that this assumption is dangerously wrong. Machiavelli wrote, "A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good." He wasn't being cynical. He was acknowledging a reality that modern psychology has confirmed. A small but significant percentage of people simply do not experience the emotional constraints of conscience that the majority take for granted. Stout's research puts actual numbers to this observation. She estimates that roughly 4% of the general population are sociopaths. People who can understand the rules of morality intellectually, but do not feel the emotional weight of conscience that keeps most people ethical. This means in a typical office of 50 people. Statistically speaking, you're working alongside about 2 people who entirely lack conscience. In a neighborhood of 500 homes, approximately 20 households have at least one person with no conscience. This isn't rare, it's common. I recall consulting for a company where an executive made a decision that destroyed the retirement savings of dozens of long-term employees while preserving his own compensation package. When confronted privately about the human impact, he seemed genuinely confused by the concern, asking, "Why would I factor their problems into my decision? That's not my responsibility." What struck me wasn't dishonesty, but a genuine inability to understand why he should care about harm to others when it didn't affect him personally. It was a chilling demonstration of conscience simply being absent. Both Machiavelli and Stout identified a crucial characteristic of people without conscience. They're not obvious. Machiavelli observed that successful princes must appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright, whether they actually possessed these qualities or not. He was describing how those without internal moral constraints must carefully mimic the external behaviors that conscience produces in others. Stout notes exactly the same pattern in modern sociopaths. They aren't the obviously disturbed or criminal elements of society, though some certainly are. Most are high-functioning individuals who have learned to imitate the behaviors that conscience generates in others. They observe and mimic normal human emotional responses while feeling none of the underlying moral emotions. I witnessed this mimicry in action when a manager responded to news of a colleague's family tragedy with seemingly perfect empathy, appropriate facial expressions, thoughtful words, and offers of support. Later that same day, I accidentally overheard him mocking the situation to another colleague, laughing about how he'd nailed the concerned face everyone expected. The empathy was a performance he could turn on and off like a switch, because it wasn't anchored in genuine emotional experience. This brings us to another key insight. Both Machiavelli and Stout share. People without conscience have significant advantages in power competitions. Machiavelli noted that rulers who were willing to break faith when necessary would always triumph over those who felt bound by moral constraints. He wasn't advocating for immorality. He was observing a natural power imbalance created by the presence versus absence of conscience. Stout explains this same dynamic in modern terms. Conscience creates limitations the sociopath doesn't experience. While normal people feel bad about exploiting others, lying, breaking promises, or causing harm, those without conscience feel none of these emotional constraints. This creates what Stout calls the sociopath's advantage in competitions for power, resources, and status. I observed this advantage directly in a corporate power struggle. Two executives were competing for the same promotion. One was brilliant, hard-working, and bound by strong ethical principles. The other was equally intelligent but unconstrained by moral considerations. The second candidate systematically sabotaged his rival through false information, claiming credit for his work and undermining him with leadership while maintaining a friendly facade. The conscience-bound executive was limited in his response because certain tactics felt wrong to him, while his rival experienced no such limitations. Not surprisingly, the unrestrained competitor prevailed. Both Machiavelli and Stout also recognized how this conscience imbalance shapes social structures. Machiavelli observed that throughout history, certain personality types naturally rise to positions of power, not because of superior abilities, but because of their willingness to do what others won't. Stout notes the same pattern, explaining how sociopaths are statistically overrepresented in positions of power and influence precisely because they're willing to use tactics that those with conscience find unthinkable. This doesn't mean all leaders lack conscience, far from it. But it does mean there's a selection pressure that advantages those without conscience in competitions for power. The result is that the 4% who lack conscience often control resources and decisions affecting the 96% who have conscience. This creates a fundamental power imbalance in society that both Machiavelli and Stout recognized. I saw this dynamic clearly in local politics, where a candidate with minimal qualifications but no moral constraints systematically eliminated more qualified rivals through personal attacks, false accusations, and manipulation of voter concerns. Those bound by ethical standards were literally playing by different rules than he was, creating an uneven competitive landscape that favored the least conscientious candidate. Another key insight both Machiavelli and Stout share is about how people without conscience view those with conscience. Machiavelli observed that those who set aside moral constraints often view those who don't as weak or foolish. Stout notes the same pattern, explaining that sociopaths typically see conscience as a weakness to be exploited rather than a virtue to be respected. In her research, Stout found that sociopaths often specifically target highly conscientious people, those with strong empathy, desire to help others, and commitment to keeping their word. From the sociopath's perspective, these traits aren't admirable. They're vulnerabilities to be leveraged for personal gain. I witnessed this targeting pattern when a new manager joined a nonprofit organization known for attracting idealistic, mission-driven employees. Rather than sharing their values, he saw their idealism as a weakness to exploit. He systematically identified the most conscientious team members and loaded them with additional responsibilities, knowing their sense of duty would prevent them from refusing. He then took credit for their work while presenting himself as the pragmatic problem solver needed to focus the impractically idealistic team. Within a year, he had risen to executive leadership while burning out the most dedicated employees. Both Machiavelli and Stout also recognized how difficult it is for conscience-bound people to understand those without conscience. Machiavelli noted that ordinary people struggle to imagine the mindset of those who don't share their moral constraints. Stout makes the same observation, explaining that our natural tendency to project our own conscience onto others makes us vulnerable to those who don't share this internal constraint. She calls this the assumption of conscience, our default belief that others must feel bad when they harm people, just as we would. This assumption creates a blind spot that makes it extremely difficult for normal people to recognize or effectively respond to those without conscience. I've seen this blind spot create problems in countless organizations. When conscience-bound people encounter behavior that appears immoral or harmful, they naturally look for explanations that make sense within their conscience-oriented framework. They must not understand the harm they're causing. They must be acting out of some personal pain. They must believe they're doing the right thing for some reason I don't see. These explanations make sense if you're dealing with someone who has a conscience but may have different information, perspective, or priorities than you. But they're completely inaccurate when applied to someone without conscience, leading to ineffective responses that often make the situation worse. I consulted for a company where an executive repeatedly made promises he never intended to keep. His conscience-bound colleagues kept giving him chances, assuming he must have faced unexpected obstacles or misunderstood expectations. Their inability to grasp that he simply didn't feel bad about lying, that he experienced none of the emotional discomfort they would feel in that situation, allowed the pattern to continue for years, causing significant organizational damage. Both Machiavelli and Stout also identified what might be the most dangerous aspect of this dynamic. People without conscience often rise to positions where they make rules for others. Machiavelli observed this pattern in political leadership throughout history. Stout notes the same tendency in modern institutions, where those least constrained by conscience often end up creating and enforcing the rules that govern those who are conscience-bound. This creates a profound power imbalance in society, where a small minority who don't experience the emotional constraints of conscience often control the social, legal, and organizational structures that everyone else must operate within. I observed this dynamic in a professional association where a small group of particularly ruthless individuals gained control of the governance structure. They systematically created rules that benefited themselves while presenting these changes as necessary for the organization. Because they personally didn't feel constrained by the rules they created, they could easily work around them while enforcing them strictly on others, creating a two-tiered system that consolidated their advantage. So how can conscience-bound people, the 96% majority, protect themselves from those without conscience in positions of power? Both Machiavelli and Stout offer valuable guidance. First, recognize the reality rather than denying it. Machiavelli urged people to see things as they are, not as they wish them to be. Stout similarly emphasizes the importance of acknowledging that not everyone experiences the emotional constraints of conscience, despite appearances. This recognition alone dramatically improves your ability to navigate situations involving conscience-free individuals. I worked with an organization that transformed after finally acknowledging that their charismatic leader simply didn't share the moral framework they had been projecting onto him. After years of excusing harmful behavior with increasingly convoluted explanations, they were finally able to implement appropriate boundaries and safeguards once they accepted the fundamental conscience mismatch. Second, look for patterns rather than explanations. Machiavelli advised judging people by the results of their actions rather than their stated intentions. Stout similarly recommends focusing on behavioral patterns rather than the explanations people offer. When someone repeatedly causes harm while providing plausible justifications each time, the pattern is more informative than the individual explanations. I consulted for a company that wasted years trying to understand why a senior leader repeatedly engaged in the same harmful behaviors despite multiple interventions. Each incident came with a seemingly reasonable explanation, and his apparent remorse seemed genuine. The breakthrough came when they finally focused on the consistent pattern rather than the inconsistent explanations, revealing the manipulation beneath the surface. Third, establish and maintain strong boundaries. Both Machiavelli and Stout emphasize the importance of creating clear boundaries when dealing with conscience-free individuals. Machiavelli advised keeping potentially dangerous people at a distance where you can observe their actions, but they cannot affect your own. Stout similarly emphasizes the importance of establishing firm boundaries that don't rely on appeals to conscience or empathy. I witnessed a department's transformation after implementing clear, non-negotiable boundaries with a conscience-free leader. Rather than hoping he would understand the impact of his actions, an appeal to conscience he didn't possess, They created structural limits on his authority that didn't depend on his emotional understanding or agreement. This shift from hoping for moral insight to implementing concrete boundaries completely changed the power dynamic. Fourth, form alliances with other conscience-bound individuals. Machiavelli emphasized the importance of strategic alliances as protection against those with greater power. Stout similarly notes that conscience-free individuals often use isolation tactics to prevent conscience-bound people from comparing notes and recognizing manipulation patterns. Forming strong connections with others can provide both protection and reality checking. I saw this strategy work effectively when employees at one company began sharing their experiences with a manipulative executive. Individually, each person had doubted their own perceptions, wondering if they were misinterpreting situations or being too sensitive. Collectively, they recognized the clear pattern of manipulation and were able to implement group strategies for protection that would have been impossible individually. Fifth, use institutional safeguards whenever possible. Machiavelli recognized the importance of laws and institutions as constraints on individual power. Stout similarly emphasizes the value of formal processes and documentary evidence when dealing with those without conscience, who often rely on private interactions that can later be denied or reframed. I consulted for an organization that transformed its vulnerability to a conscience-free leader by implementing simple institutional safeguards, requiring written follow-up after verbal agreements, involving multiple people in key decisions, and creating clear documentation trails for important interactions. These structural changes reduced the leader's ability to manipulate through later denial or distortion of private conversations. Now, let's address an important ethical question. What is the difference between Machiavellian strategic thinking and sociopathic manipulation? After all, both involve a clear-eyed view of human behavior and power dynamics that goes beyond conventional morality. The crucial difference lies in the presence or absence of conscience. Ethical Machiavellian strategy acknowledges the realities of human nature and power dynamics, but remains guided by a functional conscience and concern for the greater good. The strategic thinker might make difficult choices that cause some harm, but they feel the moral weight of those decisions and seek to minimize unnecessary suffering. Sociopathic manipulation uses similar insights about human behavior, but without the constraints of conscience. The harm caused to others creates no emotional discomfort for the manipulator, who is concerned solely with personal advantage regardless of the cost to others. I've observed this distinction clearly in crisis situations. A conscience-guided leader might make painful cuts during financial difficulty, but they experience genuine distress about the impact. Try to minimize harm and feel accountable for both the decision and its effects. A conscience-free leader in the same situation experiences no emotional discomfort about the harm caused, sees affected people merely as unfortunate collateral damage, and focuses exclusively on how to leverage the situation for personal advantage. Machiavelli himself recognized this distinction. While he advised rulers to set aside conventional morality when necessary for the state's survival, he consistently emphasized that the legitimate purpose of such actions was the greater good of the society, not the ruler's personal enrichment or gratification. This underlying concern for a purpose beyond self-interest reflects the presence of conscience, even if expressed differently than conventional morality might suggest. This brings us to the final crucial insight both Machiavelli and Stout share. Conscience-bound people need to balance ethical idealism with practical reality. Machiavelli criticized those who imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in reality, arguing that focusing on how things should be rather than how they actually are leads to disaster. Stout similarly warns against naive idealism that refuses to acknowledge the reality of conscience-free individuals in positions of power. Both emphasize that protecting yourself and others from those without conscience doesn't require abandoning your own moral compass. Instead, it means developing a more sophisticated understanding of human nature that acknowledges the full spectrum of human psychology, including the uncomfortable reality that conscience is not universal. I worked with a nonprofit organization whose mission was centered on compassion and second chances. Their idealism became a vulnerability when a conscience-free individual joined the organization and systematically exploited their commitment to seeing the best in everyone. The transformation came when they realized they could maintain their values while still implementing appropriate boundaries and safeguards. They didn't become less compassionate. They became more realistically compassionate in ways that protected their mission rather than undermining it. So what can we learn from this exploration of how Machiavelli anticipated Martha Stout's insights into conscience and power? First, that the absence of conscience in a small but significant portion of the population creates profound implications for social power structures. Second, that recognizing this reality doesn't make you cynical. It makes you more effectively idealistic by allowing you to implement meaningful protections for yourself and others. Most importantly, this understanding helps explain why purely idealistic approaches to social change often fail. When we design systems assuming universal conscience, we create vulnerabilities that are inevitably exploited by those who don't experience this internal constraint. Effective, sustainable social structures need to balance optimism about human potential with realistic safeguards against those who lack conscience. For your own development, start noticing these dynamics in your professional and personal environments. Pay attention to patterns rather than isolated incidents or explanations. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong despite plausible justifications. Implement boundaries based on behavior rather than appeals to conscience. And most importantly, don't let the reality of conscience-free individuals make you doubt your own moral compass. It's not naive to have conscience, just naive to assume everyone else does too. Next time, we'll shift our focus to explore how Machiavelli's insights intersect with Angela Duckworth's research on grit and perseverance, examining how the most effective leaders throughout history have turned setbacks into advantages through psychological resilience. If you found this valuable, hit subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you encountered situations where assuming universal conscience created problems? What strategies have you found effective for maintaining your values while protecting yourself from exploitation? Let me know below. This information is provided for educational purposes only. The goal is to help you better understand social dynamics and protect yourself from exploitation, not to encourage cynicism or amateur diagnosis of mental health conditions.